I think we'll just get started. So thank you very much for coming along to the introduction to the dissertation. I hope you're looking forward to this particular part of your studies. It's always the light at the end of the tunnel, and you may be sitting there with lots of enthusiasm or fear and trepidation, or probably a mixture of both. But I hope that today's session at least puts the dissertation in context for you, and if you do have any anxieties, then we're able to try and address them in the context of what we're covering this morning, but also in relation to meeting up with your programme leads later on today, sort of later this morning. As I say, this session is being videotaped for students who couldn't manage along today, for students online, and also for students in our London campus. So we'll curtail any questions till coffee break, and I'm happy to answer those on an individual basis if you have any. So, in terms of what we're hoping to do today is really explore the key requirements of your dissertation as the final part of your master's degree, and in that context begin to unpick the academic demands of undertaking this dissertation, the expectations around students and supervisors, because supervisors are absolutely critical to supporting you complete this module. So we want to provide that level of key information to support your studies around the module, supervision, and where relevant in relation to ethical requirements. Now, I know for many of you probably sitting in the room, you're thinking, perhaps I don't need ethics. We'll come to that later on, but in terms of that, today's timetable does contain a section on ethics, and if you're doing an empirical research study where you're going out and physically collecting data, this session you require to attend. If you're doing a structured literature review and you don't want to sit through the ethics, although it's much more about the process rather than the actual principles, I'm quite happy for you to omit that session if you're doing that review, but I will leave that up to you. In the context of the kind of programmes that are undertaking the dissertation just now, we have health and social care, nursing, public health, physiotherapy, and podiatric surgery. So this morning will be around talking about the dissertation in relation to those programmes, and then this afternoon there is a formatting workshop, which, despite me telling you it was in the George Moore building when I first sent out the information, it's actually in the Government Becky building, and I've reprinted the information on that, so I'll give you that out later this morning. But that's from 2 to 4. This workshop session, I can't stress how invaluable it will be to you. In fact, many students say, I wish I had this at the beginning of the course. Because the dissertation is quite a wieldy document, formatting it in a presentation style is incredibly important because it should be of publishable standard, and that's something that examiners will look at. So it's a very, very important session for you to attend this afternoon. And as I say, it's very highly valued by students who undertake it. It's hands-on, so it's in the computer lab, so you'll get lots of practice about putting your document together at this stage, and then that will only allow you to go in and then just populate it. Dissertation done, very easy after that. I'm only joking. So, as I've indicated already, this is obviously your final module in the completion of your master's degree. And in that context, we are looking for you to demonstrate, as part of undertaking an in-depth project, masterly thinking, and those academic skills that are based on an independent study. So we're looking for creativity, originality, synthesis, evaluation, problem solving, all those skills that we've talked about all the way through your programmes. But we're looking at it in the context of research-related skills in developing your dissertation, which is essentially a report that contains very specific chapters in relation to such areas as a lit review, methodology, results, discussion. And these kind of words will not be new to you, having undertaken the EERDIP module in preparing for that. And that's where we hope that your protocol in undertaking that will allow you to smoothly progress onto the dissertation. However, that's not to say that some students don't change their mind and they may pick another subject area. It just means you've got maybe a little bit more work to do in terms of shaping up your ideas and your methodology in terms of how you're going to execute that. So what makes this different from anything you've done before? And I think that's an important question to address at this stage, because it is so diametrically different from anything you've undertaken so far. I think the most obvious thing is it's typically longer. Yes, you've got 15,000 words for this particular piece of work. And although that might seem quite a massive undertaking, there are students who, believe me, will struggle to contain it to 15,000 words. The important thing here is don't focus on 15,000 words, focus on small components on it as you go along. And the dissertation handbook, we'll have a look at that later on, and that will give you very distinctive pointers about how many words for particular chapters. One of the other key things about this module is there is no syllabus. After today, I probably won't see you again until you're walking across that stage at graduation. And that's because you then become under the care and guidance of your academic supervisor. So there are no scheduled classes. Only those arrangements you make with your supervisor, and that's done in an individual base that suits both you and the supervisor. This is a study where very much you are in charge, you are in the driving seat to take this project forward. Our role as supervisors is exactly that, it's advisory. We will advise you, we won't do anything actively as part of your project, but I have to say the calibre of supervisors we have is exceptionally high. We have exceptionally high pass rates in this module, so I know you're in very safe hands. One of the key things about undertaking your project is decision making on your part, and I talked about those masterly skills in the previous slide about originality, creativity on the researcher's part. So the steer is most definitely coming from you, but as I say, your supervisors is always in the background, holding your hand and keeping your back. So please be reassured by that. In terms of the module's aim, as I've said once or twice already, it's a piece of independent work, and that means that you are in charge of the planning, the evaluation, and the project management skills. And that's a really important last part of that phrase, project management skills, because that is the key. We want you to hit the ground running with this and have a view from beginning to end how you're going to execute this. Also in doing that, you're going to get the opportunity to apply all those principles of research that you learnt about in the EERDIP module and use those to demonstrate a practical understanding around established techniques in relation to research inquiry based on the particular topic of interest. We hope by the end of this module it will enable you to develop that level of creativity and originality in applying research, knowledge and theory to be awarded your master's exit. One of the things I'm going to stress at this stage is there's a number of learning outcomes contained within your handbook. As part of your reading, and I hope you've had the opportunity to look at it already, I would suggest you use this as a checklist for learning and preparing the master's dissertation report. There are lots of areas in there that you're going to use to cross-refer to all the time, so it's going to be a really close document in terms of you'll be flicking back and forward through it quite often. But use those learning outcomes to make sure you've achieved all of the requirements of the dissertation. I alluded to earlier that your supervisors will be absolutely intrinsic to supporting you in this process, but quite clearly there's a number of other things kicking in there as well. This module introduction is also a part of that support process, and the workshop this afternoon. And folks in London and online, in relation to that workshop, these materials will be online. And particularly for the GCU London students, I'll be in touch with you to discuss perhaps a webinar around the formatting session. In terms of supervision, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later on, but essentially it's 18 hours allocated for academic support, and that's whether you're a full-time and undertaking the module over 15 weeks or part-time undertaking it over 30 weeks. But that can happen in lots of different guises. It can be in face-to-face on campus, it can be telephone, it can be email, it can be Skype. Supervisors are very flexible in terms of what might be appropriate, because for some students they're in full-time employment and therefore their capacity to attend might be compromised slightly. So we're happy to try and work around you as we can. In terms of materials, GCU Learn will also provide you with support, and you'll have access to the EERDIP as well. So if there's something that you covered, perhaps in the electives, that you want to go back and look at, you can still go back into the EERDIP module if you're attached to it. Jamie doesn't shut that down, so again, it's another resource. And for those of you undertaking empirical study and require ethics, then the School of Health and Life Sciences ethics pages will contain all the information you require to make your ethics submission. But again, we're going to look at that a little bit later on this morning. So there's a whole range of things out there that are intended to support you on this journey through the dissertation. In terms of processes and outcomes, quite clear that you're going to have to think very carefully about planning and executing an independent project. And I would encourage you to take the time at this stage to think it through, as I've said earlier, from start to finish, not only in timelines, but as discrete components of what are you going to do when and how is that going to be timed. Your supervisor will guide you on that, and obviously you've had some experience in thinking about that in the EERDIP module where you put together a Gantt chart as part of your protocol. So again, you're going to have to revisit that in terms of very distinct time to undertake this project. As you know, you have distinct options in relation to the kind of study you want to undertake. Some of you may be opting for an empirical research study where you're going out and gathering primary data yourself, and others may be undertaking a structured literature review where you're examining studies that are already published in the public domain. Just out of interest, can I see how many of you are doing an empirical study? Okay, so I'm just one person doing a structured review? Yeah. Two? Okay, that's grand. A wee bit more detail around the empirical study then. I've indicated this is a very practical study. I appreciate that what I'm talking about you should be relatively familiar with, having undertaken EERDIP and produced your protocol. And I hope by this stage this is actually me just recapping what's required rather than new information for you. But it involves in identifying a topic area that's relevant to your professional background. It needs to be appropriate, feasible and amenable for research inquiry and exploration, and it has to be realistic. I appreciate sometimes in students producing protocols for EERDIP, which is essentially an academic piece of work, they can be quite creative and optimistic about what can be achieved. And sometimes when you come to the dissertation and you sit down with your supervisor, and although you may have done very well in EERDIP, and I'm sure you're waiting for your marks to pop up at some point, your supervisor will say to you, I'm not sure that's quite feasible, or you may have to pull that in slightly, because students are ambitious and that's something that we encourage. But now you're into dissertation mode and your supervisor is not essentially wearing an academic hat in that role. They are supporting you to undertake something that's achievable in the time frame that you have and the constraints that you have. So don't be disappointed if you do get that situation where they're asking you to modify or consider slight changes. It's because they think that to make it feasible, appropriate, realistic, a bit of tweaking has to occur. Okay. I hope by now you have thought about a definitive question stroke aim, and I don't really mind how you phrase that because some students will produce an aim rather than a question, but they should be accompanied by key objectives, no matter how you phrase a question or an aim. The empirical research study will entail you carrying out the research and reporting in your dissertation and engaging with a selection of established and traditional techniques for data collection analysis and that critical discussion. And as you know, ethical approval will be required to undertake this particular study. Alternatively, if you're doing a structured review, it's a desktop study. It's a nice way of capturing the idea of that, but nonetheless is a research study conducted on pre-existing primary research studies. It's not looking at previous systematic reviews that have been undertaken. You can certainly refer to them in perhaps your background literature, but for the purpose of what you're doing with this, it's a primary studies you're looking for. And the aim here is to offer a critical, in-depth examination of literature in order to answer a practice-based question or aim. And of course, we're looking for that appropriately phrased question or aim that's relevant to your professional discipline or background. It will also provide the opportunity in the context of structured reviews, systematic reviews, to engage with very explicit processes around selecting, appraising, interpreting, extracting and summarising data in order to produce a new story around investigating the topic of interest. In terms of that structured literature review, and this is really important at this stage that you've grasped this, because occasionally students will come with a protocol that's indicating that they're using both quantitative and qualitative methods, which we hope we've made clear as part of EERDIP. However, in conducting the structured review, you want to undertake a study that evaluates the effectiveness of an intervention, so it's very clearly focused on quantitative studies, or a study that's exploring qualitative findings to generate new insights into a particular topic area, and it's focusing on qualitative studies. So not both. We're not looking for an integrative study, which is a combination of both, or a scoping study, which again is quite different. It's a very, very wide-ranging. These studies are too onerous. It's not that you're not capable of doing it. It's often because it's too onerous and you can't do it in the time frame or the word count you've been allocated. So again, your supervisors will be advising you to narrow it down, to keep it manageable at this stage. The next section here indicates that it requires the same amount of rigour as undertaking an empirical study, and I'm going to emphasise that to you. Some students seem to think it's a soft option. It is not. It's actually incredibly demanding. And you're undertaking this study in particular because you're looking at the validity of findings, which often have more impetus than undertaking or reviewing a single study in terms of looking at the evidence that provides. Ethical approval is not normally required to undertake a structured review because the studies that you are normally trying to access are already in the public domain. Having said all that, we anticipate that you will be able to demonstrate through the process of critical inquiry that the nature of this subject that you're interested in aligns with your programme of study. I get quite dismayed at times if I pick up a research dissertation and I have no idea the professional background or discipline it's coming from or where it's located. You have to make that explicit. And what I'm saying, in other words, is if you're undertaking a study that's public health related, for example, I expect to see that articulated, and I expect to see how that aligns with the principles and practices of public health. Similarly, if it's physiotherapy, diagnostic imaging, podiatry, nursing, whatever the context, you have to make that clear. It should never come across to the reader that they have no idea what the professional discipline is or where it's being located. And that's because this is the culmination of your studies so far in relation to that degree area. So you want to bring all of that into this particular piece of work. So in that context, the area of exploration and the question has to be agreed as appropriate. However, because of the nature of this module, as you realise, there are several programmes already at the moment being included in the module just now. I, as a module leader, have looked at your titles and have a thought around some of them in terms of being appropriate, or some that might need to be tailored slightly more. And you're going to have an initial discussion today with your programme leader about the appropriateness of your title. But again, I'm going back to that issue of your supervisor may say to you, we have to alter this slightly to make sure it fits. So there's flexibility and refining as a consequence of that. In terms of general format, there's lots of information in the handbook about how this should look, about the criteria around particular aspects of it, and you'll find those in the appendices. And there's also an indication of the rough word count for each of these sections. Now that's a rough idea so that you don't spin out of control and provide a literature review that's 10,000 words and then suddenly find that when you get to the discussion section, which carries a lot of weight in terms of marks, you've only got 2,000 words to write that, because you're going to severely compromise your success if you do that. It's not prescriptive in the number of words, as long as you don't exceed the word count, and we'll look at that a little later on. But if you can work roughly within these parameters, you'll be fine, because it's also heartbreaking to write 8,000 words of a literature review and then find you've got to cut it to 3 because you've done all that work. But that's also a trick of master's level study, in that you have to be able to synthesize and be a bit more discreet about how much you put in and your arguments around that. So it's not about volume, it's about how you're delivering an in-depth argument and your criticality in relation to particular sections of the work. So for an empirical study, what we'd be expecting to see is an abstract. Again, that succinct outline of your study approach and findings. And of course, you won't be able to do that until you get to the end, so you can leave that one very comfortably. Same with your acknowledgements, context pages, introduction, chapter 1, lit review, chapter 2, and it's a traditional literature review, so you're looking at scoping the knowledge base, looking at policy, research, opinion pieces. It's the background. It's not extensive in terms of looking at only research studies, but we expect to see criticality coming through that, so it's a traditional review. Methodology and methods, as you might expect, it's quite self-explanatory. Results, discussion, conclusion, recommendations, references and appendices. That's the standard format, and as I say, there's very discrete guidance in Appendix 7. You'll see that I've put an asterisk around results and discussion, so if you're undertaking an empirical study that's qualitative, we would be encouraging you to think about amalgamating both these chapters, so that would be chapter 4 and chapter 5, because that's how qualitative research is reported in contemporary literature. However, that's a discussion you need to have with your supervisor. It's also going to be economical around words, because you will be using a lot of verbatim commentary in the results chapter, so you want to be able to condense the discussion and tag it on to that particular section. But again, that's a detailed discussion you will have with your supervisor. The structured review is not dissimilar in terms of the abstract, acknowledgement, contents. However, when you get to the introduction, the background literature are actually combined here, because you're again setting the scene. You're looking at what is the knowledge base in relation to this topic area, where are the gaps, have there been systematic reviews undertaken in the past, etc. Methodology and methods are consistent with undertaking a structured review, as opposed to the empirical study. Results, discussion, conclusion, recommendations, references and appendices. So again, that's the basic structure for the structured review. As I say, there is very specific detailed guidance in that handbook around those key sections, word counts, but it's not prescriptive in any shape or form. And even within the particular chapters, the kind of subheadings, the topics you're going to explore are going to reflect the nature of what you're looking at and what you're presenting in terms of these particular areas. So it's a discussion with your supervisor. talked a little bit already about the invaluable contribution that formatting the dissertation will make. It will make your life so much easier, and you'll walk out of here today, if you get to that session, feeling a little bit more comfortable about how to present this. For the folks who are online, the formatting handbook is located on GCU Learn, and if you're running into problems with any aspect of formatting, you can contact the Academic Development Tutors for further advice, and information on how to contact them is in the university web pages. The word count. For both an empirical study and a structured review, the word count is 15,000 words. However, you are allowed a 10% excess on that, so the absolute minimum is 16,500 for this module. Now, for the folks who are doing empirical work, I wouldn't be surprised if you are in and around 60,000 words. For the folks doing the structured review, you might actually find that you are significantly lower than that. And it's not unusual to have a very, very good structured review coming in about 13,500 words. There is no lower limit penalty. It's only if you go over 16.5. Okay? But you don't want to miss key issues out. So again, that'll be a discussion with you and your supervisor, but you've got flexibility. There's a range in there that you can work to. I would be suggesting for those doing a structured review, if you're hitting around 12,000 and you think you've finished, look at it again, just to make sure you haven't missed anything, because the word count is there. What does that comprise of? Everything from your abstract, and from the first word of the first chapter to the last word of the last chapter, and everything in between. Everything in between. So if you're doing quantitative work and you've got tables in there, the words will count. That's why you've got a nice word count with a 10% excess on the other side. In terms of assessment and feedback, those sheets are already in the handbook. And again, that's one of those checklists I would go back to, because also you want to see the weighting around the marks you're going to get for particular sections of the dissertation. So it not only provides the criteria, it links it to the learning outcomes, and it tells you the percentage mark that you're going to, the maximum mark you can achieve in that particular section. So again, I would strongly encourage you, use it as a checklist. You'll find it invaluable. This is another area that I hope you'll be extremely familiar with, because you're at an advanced level of your study and you're also master's students, but it would be remiss of me not to mention this in terms of our expectations of master's students. The familiarity with plagiarism and ensuring that you maintain academic integrity throughout. And if you're unfamiliar with those, I would refer you to the Student Code of Conduct and the assessment regulations. But on that note, there's a bit of a strange scenario with this module, in as much as you have prepared a protocol as part of the EERDIP that may produce similarity matching between modules. Now, the watchword there is to avoid that, but quite clearly we've asked you to put together a protocol that fits with undertaking your dissertation. So the question might be, well, but you want me to use it, but you don't want me to use it. Well, yes, we do, but we want you to do something different with it now. What we don't want you to do is cut and paste big chunks of your EERDIP and drop it into particular sections of this dissertation. For example, if you have written about methodology and you just want to lift the whole lot and drop it in, then it's going to come up with a match. Similarly with the literature review section, now I hope you'll go back and revisit your literature anyway, because you undertook maybe EERDIP for some of you, not this academic session, maybe it was the academic session before or before that. So for some of you, you're going to have to revisit contemporary literature anyway. But irrespective of whether you did EERDIP this academic session or 2 years ago, what we expect now is for you to extend the depth of the discussion that you provided. If you remember in the EERDIP, if you're looking at, let's say, for example, the lit review section, you had around 600 words. For most of you, your literature review or your literature review and introduction is going to be around 3,000 words. So the depth and width of what you've looked at will need to be reviewed again. Yes, you can use some of that, and it's perhaps the same information, but you have to reconstruct it in a different way, because we do expect the depth and the level of criticality and the breadth of that to increase significantly in your dissertation. Because your protocol was a taste and flavour, this is not a taste and flavour, this is the real event. So bear that in mind, it should never ever be a cut and paste. There are some things that in that context I understand can't be changed. If you're talking about stats and you're talking about probability and quoting figures, you can't change these things. If you're talking about the World Health Organization or the Nursing and Midwifery Council or HCPC, that kind of thing, these things won't change. And the supervisors and myself understand that. So, you know, our response is proportional there. So we do expect that there might be some mapping, but what we don't want to see is great big chunks of 20 or 40 lines lifted and just dropped into your dissertation, because it will cause you problems, because your score will just ratchet up. Yes, we can track it back and look to see that it is your work, but really, in the context of your dissertation, we want to see that depth expanded anyway. Turnitin will be used again for this particular module, and the next few slides are really around plagiarism and the seriousness of an irregularity. And believe me, as a master's student with your final award coming up, you really don't want to be in a position where your work is pulled back for scrutiny because we think you've got a problem. And that's because of the level of study that you're at. And a match of 20% in a dissertation is quite different from a match of 20% on a 3,000 word essay. So again, it's likely to be proportionally higher. So again, we don't want to be in that boat, and certainly I don't want to see you in that boat when you get to the stage of submitting. I'm going to leave you to look at some of these slides because, again, I think it's fairly familiar with you in terms of what plagiarism constitutes on the particular circumstances, but I can assure you that the university will deal with it very stringently if there's an issue. And of course, there's examples there that I'm going to leave you to look at. In terms of your submission, it will be used in two ways in this module. So you can use that facility to check your work, and I think, you know, you would be remiss if you didn't take the opportunity to do the text matching and make sure your paraphrasing is really good and you've attributed to source and you've done all the good academic practice things that we expect of master's students. And of course, the external examiner has access to your work on Turnitin as well, because that's how they review it, so they will see your scores too. So take every opportunity to maintain that good academic practice. Multiple submissions are allowed right up to the deadline, so you can do it as often as you like. Just remember, you can only ever do it sort of once in 24 hours, so you want to be able to check it well in advance of the final submission. And again, just to remind you, where we'd like you to be is in the blue zone. I would say most students are in the green zone, because that tends to be that you can't avoid every instance of writing the Nursing and Midwifery Council. We do set it up to ensure that we don't include your references, and we exclude very small matches like the Nursing and Midwifery Council. So anything less than 4 words we're ignoring. Anything more than that, it'll pick up. Okay. But again, it's a tool. If we get a very high score, we'll go look at it, and sometimes it might be that you've got an appendix in there that is a data extraction tool, and it will pop up and give a score. And even if you're coming in with a score of 24, if we look at it and say, well, we know where it is, fine, we can ignore it. So please be assured we will be very judicious in terms of what we're looking for. You know that Turnitin will match it with all the other Turnitin data bank entries, and this also includes all the dissertations that have been submitted by past students in this module for several years. So they're all in there. Even the examples I have on GCU Learn at the moment are in Turnitin. So you need to very, very carefully consider the issues of copying or using it for structure, but maybe making an error along the way and not removing that, or asking for a copy, or if someone offers you a copy of theirs, by all means, if you want to look at it, that's your choice in terms of I'd like to see the structure. However, I've got examples on there to provide you with some guidance on structure. But you have to be mindful of the issues around academic integrity. The issue of academic creativity also crops up here. And I've got example chapters sitting on GCU Learn for you. I haven't released them at the moment because what I didn't want to do before we got together was to frighten you and without having a chat about what these might look like. But there are example chapters there. I also have a great big pile of them in my room, which I'm happy for you to come and look at. I can't give you them away, but I'm happy for you to spend an hour or so looking at them on campus and then returning them to me. And the idea of these exemplars is to provide you with an idea of structure about how you might do it. They're not all the same. They're quite creative in their own approach, and they've been provided by previous students, and I'm very grateful for them for doing that. The exemplars I have on GCU Learn, they're security locked, so you can't print them and you can't cut and paste from them. You can download them though, but again, that's the nature of being able to access that material, but be very, very careful in terms of what you do with them. The academic creativity issue also presents a cautionary word, and what I mean by that is quite often when you read students' work, it's got quite a formulaic run to it. So for example, if a student is explaining their search process as part of a structured review, and if you're looking at a previous student's work or an example that's on GCU Learn and it says initially that the search was commenced by adopting keywords or using PICO and then and or Boolean operators, and it forms that particular line structure, and you think, well, I can use that line, but I can change that word to put in my word. So on the next line then they talked about date parameters, so I will talk about date parameters. On the next line they talked about databases, so I'll talk about databases. It becomes very formulaic, and that will be picked up as well, and you don't want to run that risk. It's almost like a knitting pattern. So they said this, so I'll say that. They said this, so I'll say that. I'm dissuading you from doing that. You don't want to do that. You want to make it your own work and be proud of what you've done. I do acknowledge though that there are similar structural headings that may come up. For example, if you're doing a structured literature review, then there'll be a section on quality appraisal. There might be a section on methodological appraisal. There is no other way to say that. So from the point of view of headings, yes, they may be the same, and I'm not offering caution there, but it's about the narrative commentary that's underneath that. It's about your own work. So don't simply replace what you're seeing with your own words, because you're likely to perhaps induce a match in relation to previous work. Academic supervisors. You will be assigned an individual academic supervisor, and these will be a senior supervisor with significant experience, and we try to match you up to supervisors who have particular expertise in an area or particular interest in the topic. So you will have, as I say, a senior supervisor. For some of you, you may also have an associate supervisor joining the team, and they're assigned to shadow the senior supervisor. They're almost in a learning role, but they also might be there because they are offering expertise on the topic area. So although their role may be to shadow the senior, they may be contributing to assisting you in that process. So you might find you're very fortunate and have two of them. In terms of communicating who your supervisor will be, that may be quite contingent on the department that you're in. Traditionally, what happens in any of the nursing programmes, so nursing and public health, I will contact you and tell you who your supervisor is. Because there's very few of you here today, I'll probably tell you here just now. If you're in the Department of Psychology, Social Work and Allied Health, then it could be that your supervisor will be confirmed via email, particularly obviously if you're online, and I'll let GCU London students know. However, your programme lead might tell you when they come over at 12. So one way or another, I hope by close of play today, you will know who your supervisor is, because that's important in terms of, and I'm going to use that phrase again, hitting the ground running, particularly for full, because you have 15 weeks to do this from start to finish. So really you want to be contacting your supervisor perhaps today when I send you the email, or certainly next week to get the ball rolling. Because remember, supervisors are there to assist you, but they have an additional teaching workload, and probably a bit like myself, they may have 3 other students that they're supervising, so we have to fit this in. And I understand while this dominates your life just now, as it should, we have to fit it in with what we're doing. So don't be surprised if it's perhaps 7-10 days before you get together with your supervisor, but the issue for me is you get in touch with them really soon. Okay, so that you get the ball rolling, because you are entirely responsible for establishing that initial contact and maintaining it throughout the duration of the module. And should you not maintain regular contact and you become slightly concerned, then your supervisor will drop me a note to say, I'm rather concerned, student hasn't been in touch, and then I'll drop you a note to say, are you all right? Is everything going okay? Is there something we can help you with? So you'll get your contact details. I would also suggest you, when you're contacting your supervisor for the first time, you send them a copy of your EERDIP protocol, if you have it. If you don't have it, then allude to the fact that you don't have it, and that's maybe because your topic has changed, or it's been some time, or you're revisiting it. The bottom line here is you have to be in a position that when you meet your supervisor, you know what you're doing and how you're going to do it, and you know the questions you want to ask. And I'll often say to a student, if we were to get in the lift on the 6th floor, by the time we get to the bottom, can you tell me what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're going to do it, and how you think you're going to achieve it? And these are key issues for a supervisor, because they can't help you if they don't know what you're doing. And that's why providing them with a copy of your protocol is really helpful in terms of giving that background information to enable the supervisory session to get off with a bang. Okay. So again, that will be arranged with your supervisor at a convenient time that suits both of you. And as I say, we can do it using various mechanisms. In terms of supervision, do not take anything forward at this stage until you've met with your supervisor. The best advice I can give you just now is background reading on the subject area so that you're well versed and can demonstrate your knowledge and understanding. And if you're doing an empirical study, you don't really want to progress any aspect of that at all until you've had that discussion, particularly because it's going to involve ethics. Roles and responsibilities around supervisors are contained within university policy. It's probably the only teaching role that's detailed in such detail about advising and planning and implementation of your study. They will not become involved in any aspect of it, as I mentioned earlier, so please don't think they'll be there to do your analysis for you, because they won't. They will guide you through the process, but they will expect you to come up with the goods. So supervisor's role and expectations are very, very clearly defined, and I'm not going to go through those in detail. They're contained in your handbook, and you need to be familiar with the context of that. However, in terms of supporting the discussion, the relationship with your supervisor, the handbook will contain guidance on the distribution of workload and the milestones that you're expected to achieve relative to being a full-time or a part-time student. I would also encourage you to keep a record of your meetings in terms of what you've agreed, what you're still to do, so that you have a clear outline of where you're going and how you're going to get there. Supervisors are required to keep this in terms of their role, but it's advantageous for the students too, particularly for international students who might be here on a visa. So there's a template in the back for you to use, or you can construct something you want that suits your needs and your supervisor. And particularly for international students, all full-time students are required to swipe in each time they're on campus. So wherever you see one of those little blue boxes, just give it a swipe if you're in the library meeting with your supervisor. Because there are no classes, but you want to ensure that you're demonstrating that you're attending. And the all-important submission dates. If you're a full-time student, 5th of May. If you're a part-time student, 25th of August. In terms of that submission, 2 soft-bound paper copies. So we're not looking for a hardback. Don't go spending lots of money producing a hardback. You can if you want, but 2 soft-bound paper copies is quite sufficient, and they have to be submitted to the campus by 12 midday on the due date. There's a post box on the 5th floor of the Government Becky building. Please don't give them to your supervisor, because I won't know that you've submitted them, and I don't want to record a fail because they're not there. They have to go into the blue box. This date applies to all submissions, so whether you're on campus, off campus, home student, or in Switzerland, they have to arrive by the due date. And GCU Learn students, you have to submit to GCU London campus on the date. So you have to factor these things in if you're planning to post them in. You're also required to submit that electronic copy on Turnitin. And the instructions concerning submission are all contained in the handbook. And I'm going to say at this stage, you will not get your mark on Turnitin. We do not mark them. Dissertations, as you will appreciate, tend to be rather large, being 16,500 words. To mark them on Turnitin is quite an onerous task, and because they have to be independently marked by 2 people, we don't send the marks out and Turnitin. What you will get is an individual email as we approach the assessment period, providing you with feedback, and of course you will get your marks formalised after an assessment board. So, in getting to that point of submitting your dissertation, good project management skills from day one, which for everyone means from Monday, so you've got the weekend to think about it. If you run into problems, however, you can apply for an extension to the period of study, but that will only be granted in extenuating circumstances, and I can't stress this enough, because it can interfere with graduation dates as well, particularly if you're part-time and you're submitting in August and we're approaching deadlines for awarding boards and the graduation point, which all have to be completed around the autumn. If you do require an extension, then please discuss it with your supervisor first before approaching me. There is a designated pro forma that's on the GCU Learn dissertation site, which you can download, fill in and send to me, and I will either approve or reject it, but I'll do it in negotiation with your supervisor. I am the only person, along with the deputy, who's Professor Lynn Kilbride, can approve your extensions. Okay? But just bear in mind that issue around graduation. Whilst an extension might be absolutely appropriate if you need it, you may also be in a situation where you're required to think about suspending your studies and taking some time out. And that's due to personal circumstances that we often face in life. Voluntary suspension means that we will simply stop the clock. So if you get to week 8 and for some reason you have to take time out, we'll simply stop the clock, and when you come back, you'll get the number of weeks remaining, whether you're full-time, part-time, to be able to complete. I have to let you know though that whether you're full-time or part-time, if you pass the halfway point of a module, you cannot take time out. That doesn't mean to say you might not continue with your studies. You may opt not to continue with your studies, but we can't give you time out. If you pass the halfway point, you'll are deemed to be eligible to submit. And the only way you can mitigate against that is mitigating factors. Okay? So if it's up to the midpoint, you can apply for time out. If it's after that, you can still not complete, but you will have to put in mitigating factors. And again, the guidance on that is contained in the handbook and the university web pages. And again, this is just, again, advising on that voluntary suspension of time out. You'll get the number of hours, days, weeks, whatever it is, when you come back. GCU Learn. This is going to be the main repository for materials and for me communicating with you if I have to. I hope by now you've all managed to access the Master's Dissertation site for trimester B and C, and the module handbook and materials will be located on there. There are a number of word proformas, so if you're doing a statistical study and you want statistical support, there's a proforma for that. Supervision record, much of the issues that we've just discussed around timelines, milestones, records, etc. And of course those exemplars of previous dissertation chapters. You won't get a full dissertation there, you'll simply get chapters across various types of dissertations and various types of programmes. But go in and have a browse around and see what's there, because there isn't one style that's required. It's not prescriptive in that way. It's what you think is going to best demonstrate your study and how you've undertaken it. And of course there's the GCU web pages for those of you who are undertaking ethics. I've alluded to already that if you've got any issues beyond discussion with your supervisor, help with your supervisor, any issues with the modules per se, I'm your next point of call, and the programme administrator, as probably as most of you know, is Julia Wiley. Attendance monitoring, I've touched on this slightly before. As we said, there's no scheduled classes. We expect regular contact with your supervisor, and full-time students must swipe in, usually 8512 once a week in the Government Becky building. The release of results. They are not subject to the 3-week turnaround, and that's because they're huge. Having said that, there are usually a few instances where you don't know very quickly, and that's because of the timing of assessment boards as well. Because it's your final award, we don't tend to release marks till after the assessment board. However, if you have time out or suspension of studies and it's a large gap between submitting and the assessment board, we're likely to give you interim results. But normally they're released after an assessment board, and they're emailed to your GCU account, not on Turnitin. So you need to keep your GC account active. You won't get a written copy of your results, it'll come to you in an email. Okay. So what's next? At this stage, I would be saying to you, if you've not already done it, please read the handbook in detail. I know it's weighty, it's potentially boring, but take the time to read it, because it's quite frustrating when I get an email saying, when's the submission date? How many words can I use? And it's all detailed in there. That sounds rather simplistic, but that's what tends to happen. Locate or revisit your EERDIP protocol before you meet up with your supervisor, and if you can, send it to them, and contact them as soon as possible. I'm going to stop at this stage and move away from the camera and allow you to ask some questions if you have them. Questions? For half an hour now. Okay, folks, so this is the second session of the induction, which is focused on ethical approval processes, and it really builds on your previous understanding of undertaking the EERDIP module in terms of the principles and processes around securing ethics. But of course it's relevant to those of you who are doing structured reviews in terms of critiquing existing research, in terms of adhering to those accepted processes. So what we're going to look at this morning really captures some of those issues around those diverse range of norms and values and institutional regulations, essentially, that are going to help constitute and regulate scientific activity. Of course, it's crucially important for those of you who are undertaking data collection. And that's really balanced by that little diagram there that has beneficence at its core, and on either side of that, these issues about the relationship with researchers and their participants. One of the key questions is probably, as you've realised this morning and thinking about your study and how it might really map with the requirement of do you need ethics or not. Really with the context of the structured literature review, we're saying no, not normally, because that information is freely available within the public domain. However, for empirical study, yes, absolutely. But the forum for that will depend on those essential characteristics of the participants, which are not without their challenges. So much so that section 3 of the handbook has an entire section on detailed guidance around 3 particular categories of seeking ethical permission. Now, I would have to say at the moment there is nothing in there about Caldecott, because there's normally sufficient guidance at a kind of health board level about accessing patients' records, patients' data that hasn't been gathered for research purposes but is now being solicited for research processes, and it's guided by that. And I'm hoping that certainly, I've got one student here this morning who's planning to do that, and I think you've probably already begun to unpick that. And my experience so far is it's not problematic. The issue for you is what do you do after you've got Caldecott, and that will be captured what we do now. So in terms of those 3 particular categories, what we're looking for are studies that involving students that are undertaking studies in the UK with National Health Service patients, carers or service users, and within those settings, for studies involving NHS staff in the UK and other non-NHS participants, and for studies that are involving participants out with NHS UK settings. So trying to break that down, there are fundamental questions you have to think about at this stage for dissertation purposes, and it's all about considering the practicalities of making an ethical application. So what are the ethical issues you really need to consider in relation to your own study, which for some of you will be quite different because you're all doing different things. Why and what do you need to be aware of in conducting this, and how do you make sure your research is ethical? And really for those of you doing empirical work, ethics right now is the first thing in your mind. Securing ethics will allow you to move ahead in a almost linear fashion with the rest of your study. If you can get your ethics dealt with and out the way, the rest of it should be fairly plain sailing. So that's why you have to consider that at a very early juncture. And as I've said to you already, if you are, irrespective of being a full-time or a part-time student, you really want to get it done. For part-time students, you really want ethics within the first 6 weeks. For full-time student, really within the first 4 weeks. That's not to say that you won't be working on other things whilst you're going through that process of waiting for ethical approval, but it's just fundamentally important because you cannot collect data until you have ethical approval. So in terms of the recap from the EERDIP module, the duty of care lies with you to make sure that you understand and uphold the processes of ethics in relation to the governance. And you have to have a sound knowledge of those principles to be able to apply it to particular steps of the dissertation process, because it filters through all of it. And although, and I know I said this in the last time I delivered this lecture, often when you look at students' dissertation work, you come to chapter 3 and it takes you through this nice discussion about the nature of methodology and paradigms and philosophical thoughts, and as you get to the end of it, it touches on the ethics. To be perfectly frank, the ethics is the first thing you think about. So in many ways it's not surprising that the occasional essay dissertation will come in with the ethics addressed at the get-go. That's not to say you can put it wherever you like in terms of structure and making your work fluent, but it's really emphasising to you that where its positionality is. But you also need that up-to-date knowledge about procedures and processes that are designed to protect you as a researcher, fundamentally for the participants, and guard against irresponsible research, because you certainly don't want any claims of malpractice due to your own ignorance around that. But as I've said before, and I'll keep repeating, your supervisors will keep you in line in terms of ethical processes because certainly we don't want a question coming back about your particular study, because hopefully you'll be thinking about disseminating results, publishing, conference presentations, and you want to be able to demonstrate you adhere to the requirements. And that's because ethics is, for most of you, will be conducted in a public arena where we are trying to elicit public trust and make sure our research is trustworthy and socially responsible to validate the findings. So every step has to think about what are the ethical implications, and you should be using that as a sense check as you go through. Are there any ethical implications that I have missed? And the final sentence there actually just says what I said at the beginning. You don't want to jeopardise your entire project by being ethically questionable about the processes that you've adopted. And those processes and principles very keenly link to areas that you will be very, very familiar with in terms of that respect for autonomy, so people's rights to determine whether they want to take part or not, drop out at any point where that is feasible. Beneficence in terms of doing good. We certainly don't want to do any harm in any shape or form, but we also want to do some positive good in terms of generating findings or contributing to a knowledge base that has some sort of value, scientifically, practically or educationally, and it mustn't address an important issue or problem, because simply we don't want to be negligent in undertaking research that has no value to anyone. And of course, doing no harm, that duty of care to weigh up the pros and the cons against the benefits and possible harm in order for the research to eventually reach a justifiable conclusion. And of course, being fair and equitable and treating people in such a way that accords with their full rights. Again, this is not new to you, but in terms of that, it's just a reminder about those responsibilities that you have to research participants, but also to the wider research community. But we also have to think in the context of what you're doing that you may be thinking of accessing patients who are vulnerable, and you'll need to think about the issues around there, because those are high risk, and therefore your submissions need to be risk evaluated in that context. And there is information on the web pages about how we manage studies that are demonstrating a higher risk, and in completing some of the paperwork, whether it's internal or external, it will direct you specifically to demonstrate whether your study is high risk or low risk. Confidentiality, anonymity and informed consent are absolutely intrinsic to the process. Your key responsibilities also involve minimising disruption, particularly with undertaking empirical work, to both participants and organisations who are allowing you to do this and granting you permission to do so, but in situations where their ongoing relationship will continue long after you've completed your study. And you also have key responsibilities in making sure your transparency includes the findings. We don't want erroneous presentations of data or conclusions. We want trustworthy, transparent in terms of what you found and how you're presenting it, to express the views or how you've gone about it, so that we can look at your work and be confident that you've adopted the appropriate processes in terms of the way you've gathered data and ensured its robustness. And that's basically alluding to member checking if you were, for example, undertaking a qualitative study. In terms of vulnerable groups, I would be very surprised if any of you were dealing with vulnerable groups. Particularly as novice researchers, students don't tend to go down that route, but it's always worth putting this kind of comment up at this stage, to just in case we've missed something along the way in terms of looking at what you're planning to do. But extreme caution when we're dealing with participants who are vulnerable by virtue of their condition, their age, their standing in society. And again, it's very straightforward. And what we're talking about there is children who may have limited autonomy, and the sort of legal frameworks that go around that, but also health conditions. We were dealing with people with dementia or learning disabilities or any other form of cognitive impairment where their right to decide is maybe affected by health conditions. I don't think you will be really dealing with any circumstances where you would be looking for someone to give a proxy consent. We certainly probably would be suggesting you adopt an alternative type of study if that's the kind of participants you were looking for. It's rather onerous for a novice student to be doing that. Anonymity and confidentiality goes without saying that throughout we are looking to protect the anonymity of participants that you are looking to recruit to your study, and their privacy should be respected at all time, and it's a critical consideration of the information that's gathered and recorded, and you have to demonstrate how you're going about that, particularly in your methodology chapter around the ethical issues and recruitment therein. Similarly, confidentiality, the right to access data, which is willingly provided by participants, and the fact that you want to convey to participants that any information that you gather from them will be securely locked away, kept confidential, and really that pledge should be very explicit in your participant information sheet and detailing who will have access to it, and for the purpose of your particular studies, if you're undertaking empirical study, it's likely to be yourself and your supervisor. If you are planning to do qualitative work and you plan to employ someone to transcribe, for example, qualitative data from semi-structured interviews, you will have to ensure how you're going to ensure the participants' confidentiality in that process. So you have to think about people that you're going to employ as third parties to assist you in that. They'll need to be bound by those confidentiality clauses. But again, it's not something that students tend to embark on. They tend to do that themselves to allow them to embed themselves in the data in terms of their own transcriptions. But again, that's a decision to make and think about those particular areas should you decide to employ a transcriber. Informed consent needs to be respected throughout and accord with the legal requirements and constraints of professional bodies, and generally speaking, confidentiality would be respected unless there was a situation that legitimately argues that you could break confidentiality if you were told something. And really, depending on the subject area, that might be something you have to consider. If you were dealing with a particularly sensitive, legal subject area, you may wish to break confidentiality if it's going to affect another party. So it can be limited and conditional, and there is a duty of care there for you to report any instances to a relevant authority should there be harm or danger that's conveyed to you to a third party. Again, I have never come across this in the context of running this dissertation module for a good number of years now, and I think with the studies that you're planning to undertake, that would be highly unlikely as well. But again, it's important that you're aware of these sort of cautions that sit in there. And needless to say, in such cases that we're obliged to contact statutory bodies and agencies if there's evidence of wrongdoing or potential harm is uncovered. Enabling consent, you've got to provide very comprehensive confirmation in your work about how you've gone about that, and the nature and the purpose, and that happens in the participant information sheet. So for those of you who might be doing a qualitative study, then you're going to have a consent form. For those of you who are doing quantitative work, you're not, but it's going to be implicit in the nature of what you're doing and probably explicit in explaining to participants that in completing a questionnaire, online or paper-based, it really doesn't matter, that completion is indicative of consent. And once I've submitted it, I can't get it back because they're usually anonymous anyway. But you need to indicate that should they wish to withdraw at any point, particularly for those of you who are doing online surveys, you want to be able to say that consent is indicative of pressing the button, and they can withdraw at any point should they change their mind. So you also want a statement in there about it being voluntary, that it can opt out at any point prior to submission, particularly for the quantitative. Qualitative, a wee bit different. By the time you get to data analysis and amalgamating results. Very hard to separate who said what, but you have to think about that. So in terms of that information, you have to let people know what kind of data you'd like to collect, the method that you're going to do it by, and the option for them to either agree or refuse to take part. And also, if you're planning to audio record people, you need to let them know that you're planning to do that. There are some very good examples of participant information sheets on the HLS ethics website, along with consent forms, which, if you're going down that route, please consult with literally before you start to talk to your supervisor, so that you've got a working knowledge of what the requirements are. And examples of forms are there as well, so that it's all very detailed. It's actually a very good link to providing you with key information around ethics. Because what we're looking for is that confidentiality is maintained, risks and discomfort to participants who have very kindly to agree to take part in your study are minimised, both psychologically or physically, depending on what you're doing. You want to be able to provide in your consent form what might be the potential benefits and any potential harm. Again, I would be suggested likely to be very low level in terms of the studies that you will be undertaking. So potential benefits will be about helping them or helping us to contribute to a knowledge area where improvements could be made, perhaps in practice development, or policy, or particular procedures, or roles and responsibilities. But in terms of direct benefit to them, it's actually none in terms of taking part. And we've talked about the option to agree or refuse to participate. You want to be able to explain to them how data is going to be used, in as much as it will contribute to findings from a range of participants, that no one will be identifiable, that confidentiality will be maintained through the transcribing, coding and storing purposes, including the length of time it's going to be held. And for master's students, you are going to say in your ethics is you're going to retain the data for 5 years, securely for 5 years. You're required to do that. Who's going to have access to that, and how it's and when is it going to be confidentially destroyed? So the phrase is probably confidentially destroyed after a period of 5 years. In terms of thinking now about the actual pragmatics around the governance and approval processes, what I'm about to explain to you might sound quite complex, but it's not as complex as it sounds once you get into it. There are a number of do's and don'ts, but again, your supervisors are going to be holding your hand through these processes. The processes themselves may have convolutions, and that's going to depend on the particular type of study that you're undertaking. So it's rather difficult for me to stand at this stage and be able to go through all of them, because it'll be contingent on the nature of the study. But I haven't known anybody not to get ethical approval that sought it. Yes, there's sometimes little delays and speed bumps along the way, but generally speaking, I've never known a student not to get ethical approval in order to conduct their study, whether externally or internally. If we're thinking about university processes first and the governance around that, undertaking an empirical study will require ethical approval because it's involving participants and doing that in the context of working on or obtaining them whilst in different areas and even through healthcare records. So I'm thinking about that situation of Caldecott, where you're going to require university ethics approval. So all studies must have ethics before you can progress any form of data collection, and that will come from the school's ethics committee and from external sources as deemed appropriate. And I've referred a few times to the situation where one of your colleagues is looking at records, so that will involve Caldecott, and you cannot start that until you've got ethical approval granted. If you're planning to undertake an empirical study outside the UK, then again it will depend on the type of study that you're doing and in the context and the type of participants you're interested in. But one of the things that you're going to have to do is indicate that you're having to engage with local ethics organisations. So no matter whether it's a health-related organisation or perhaps an independent organisation, for example, another university, you have to find out what their local processes are first and follow them in relation to the guidance you've been given. So you want to liaise with them, find out what the local issues are and who the local gatekeepers are, and adhere to those requirements as you go. This doesn't necessarily suggest that you will not still need GCU ethics as part of that process, particularly if the local processes are happy that we provide you with ethical approval if they don't have a remit. And in some countries it's actually quite difficult to find out if there is a local process for that situation. I'll give you an example. A number of years back we had a student who was a midwife. She was working as an independent midwife in the Netherlands. So she wasn't working for the National Health Service there, but she had patients that she wished to access to undertake a study. She wished to deploy a questionnaire, so she spoke to the local health board area, and because she was an independent midwife, they felt they had no remit for that. Now, as a GCU student undertaking a research dissertation, we have a responsibility to ensure our students accord with governance processes. She obtained a note from the health authorities saying that they were happy for her to seek ethical approval through Glasgow Caledonian Ethics Committee because they did not have a remit in that context. So she was able to bring that forward, also secure local gatekeepers who were happy for her to access those patients, and together she used these two pieces of paper to apply for GCU ethics. So you may have to think about it. I know there's a few of you in the audience who are thinking of doing data collection at home, so you'll need to engage with the local processes first, find out, and then discuss it with your supervisor. And do that very, very quickly if you can. So if there's local people you can engage with to say, are there any situations where I need to abide by local ethics, and then come back to us. The Ethics Committee for the within the School of Health and Life Sciences has 3 particular departments. And for those of you who are doing public health and may be collecting data from home, you can also contact the chair, Dr. Nicola Roberts. Her details are on these slides, who will provide you with further information should you need it. But your first point of contact is to discuss this with your supervisor. So you're going to have to liaise with us and let us know what's happening, and you need that confirmation. It can't happen verbally. You can't just say, well, they told me it was okay. You're going to have an email or some sort of documentation to support your ethics. In terms of the essential characteristics that we talked about earlier, it will all be determined on participants and setting and what you're gathering. So who are the participants? How am I going to ethically access them or their data? And where am I going to collect this data from? Generally speaking, they fall into 2 groups, as we've said before: patients, carers and service users, health service employees, so we're talking about staff here, or third sector education or other organisations. In terms of access within the NHS, if you don't work in the NHS but you wanted to undertake a study on patients or staff within the NHS, this is going to be extremely challenging for you. I don't think there's anybody in that boat that's here today. And that's because you would need a research passport, which is a mechanism for non-NHS staff to obtain an honorary contract to be able to go into NHS premises and access participants. And this is a fairly protracted process. It involves particular checks around vulnerable groups, occupational health, HR, and it takes a long time. It almost takes about 3 months to do that, and for students who are full-time, it's just almost impossible. I would also argue for those of you who are part-time and not in the NHS but wanted to access NHS, you would find it equally challenging, and I would probably dissuade you from doing it and advise you to look at a third sector group rather than going through working or trying to access people in the NHS. If you're working with or hoping to access patients or staff, it does involve engagement with the research governance frameworks for health and social care, and in particular the Research Authority for Scotland, and they are responsible for ensuring the standards that apply in the context of executing research. Generally speaking, external bodies are only interested in approving studies which are classified as research, and they do provide quite definitive definitions of what research is. And in this context, it usually means the attempt to generalise new knowledge using clearly defined questions, systematic and rigorous methods. And to be perfectly honest, when you look at some of the assessment tools around that, about deciding about what's research and what's not, it does allude to patients and changing treatment and changing treatment protocols or pathways. So for the vast majority of students who are undertaking studies here involving staff or NHS, it more aligns with their definition of what is a review or an audit or a service evaluation is the type of language that tends to be used. And that's where it's just considered a slightly different type of project, where you're not actually changing anything that is as part of patient care or how services are delivered. And for that context, it would be managed as the research within the NHS of social care, so there's no requirement to progress external ethical approval. Projects that may involve external ethical approval will go through various structures, and it is different in the 4 countries in the UK in relation to that. So when thinking about it, you have to lock in with particular guidance that's offered. It's very difficult for us in the university to be prescriptive about ethical processes that are external to us, because ethical external processes don't differentiate the fact that you're a student or another researcher. So you have to simply abide by their guidance. And if you're undertaking single site research, which most of you are, you're not sort of undertaking a pan-Scotland study of 4 health boards or a number of staff across the length and breadth of the country, then it would be the local R&D research and development office that you would be contacting as your first point of contact. They're usually very, very helpful and happy to give you advice. But the advice they give you is going to be contingent on how they're going to categorise your study. So is it research or is it something different? Are we looking at a service evaluation? Are we looking at an audit? So you want a discussion about the project. When I introduced this in EERDIP last session, I advised students to think about using the Health Research Authority decision tool to determine, is my project research, and use that to preface any discussions that you have about undertaking the study. Now, I think, to the best of my knowledge, there's one person in the room who's planning to access staff. So you want to look at this as well. It perhaps isn't going to be wholly applicable, but it's good to have gone through anyway in terms of what's it asking me to define my research. So when you go onto this tool, and that's the web link there across the top, it will ask you, is my study research? And it's using parameters such as, are the participants in your studies randomised to different groups or not? So if you're undertaking a quantitative survey, it's unlikely you're going to do randomisation to different groups. You may do some randomisation and including them in the study, but you're not perhaps going to randomise them to different groups. If you're undertaking a qualitative study, then you're definitely not randomising them to different groups. So in both cases, I think you would say no. Does your study protocol demand changing treatment, patient care from accepted standards for any of the patients involved? No, because you would, in the context of what you're doing as master's researchers, there's no way you're going to do that, so that's categorically no. Are your findings going to be generalised? Well, they might. If you're doing a quantitative study and you've done randomisation, you're not just using a convenience sample, then you might be able to generalise your findings. So you may say yes. But for many of you who are maybe using staff, you're going to use a sample of convenience anyway, so you won't be randomising. You could only apply your findings to that particular group. So the answer might be no. And having answered no to all these questions, it says your study would not be considered research. And you jump up for joy and tell them that when you phone to say, how am I going to progress this study when you talk to R&D? Generally speaking, if you are looking to undertake research with staff, you do not need ethical approval externally, you only need ethical approval internally. However, if you advise your study as research, and sometimes that does happen, because we are not in control of that, if you are dealing with the NHS in any shape or form, you may be required to complete an integrated research application form through the IRAS process. My first advice to you is don't panic. It's a single electronic system that will provide ethical and R&D approval for your study. It's dynamic, so it'll only fill in the questions or ask the questions it needs to ask based on what you have covered. And there's lots of guidance on my research project. You can actually work through a little module that shows you how to do it. Your supervisors will probably have an account and will be well versed in undertaking this. You will also need gatekeeper access permission, so if you're planning to access staff, for example, you will need the permission of perhaps the lead nurse or the unit director or senior nurse, lead nurse, whatever they're called as they keep changing their titles, and I'm using nursing as an example here, and that will have to go in as well. However, once you have external ethics approved, you're required to come back to us and log it in the context of the School Ethics Committee so that we know you have it. I would say on average we may see 1 or 2 students a year out of about 100 having to go through external ethics. Most students will come through the School of Health and Life Sciences. And in the context of what you're often trying to do, it's staff students wish to access. They can be employed by the NHS in this context, and you do not need ethical approval externally. So it's internal approval through the school. You still need gatekeeper access permission to approach them to say, would you like to take part in my study? An early discussion with the local R&D committee, and again their addresses and web links are listed on the HLS website page, needs to be undertaken, and that's because it involves NHS employees, and normally students will want to collect the data on NHS premises, so they need to know about it. That's the fundamental context of that. And I would be using that tool that I used earlier to say, I've undertaken this tool, I've looked at it, I know I don't need external approval, I'm not changing anything, I'm actually looking at what's happening in service at the moment, and they're likely to say it's a service evaluation, and they will send you an email accordingly. They will also probably ask you to log your study with clinical effectiveness or clinical governance, and they will give you the advice on that, okay, and they will tell you who to contact. If you're planning to undertake a study involving third sector organisations, voluntary groups, education, any other, you still need ethical approval, but it will come through the school. Now that's contingent on what I've just said about those students who are probably thinking about doing this at home. You'll have to look at your particular local arrangements, but I'm thinking about this in the context of perhaps someone wishing to undertake a study perhaps in this university. They would have to secure ethics approval. They would need gatekeeper access permission from the head of department, and that would need to accompany the ethics submission. But you almost all, I can't think of any situation where you wouldn't need gatekeeper approval. And I think we've looked at those in terms of the kind of examples that would be needed for patients for third sector or from an educational perspective. This is the link to the web pages. As I say, I'm going to put all of these slides up onto GCU Learn at lunchtime, so you'll be able to look at the web links. All of these links are actually in the handbook, so the handbook will be there as well, so you'll be able to go into the electronic form of the handbook you've got in front of you and just click on the links, and that'll make it easier for you. But as you can see from this, it is going through exactly what you need to do from the university, NHS R&D, general guidelines, applications to our committee, IRAS applications, gatekeeper access, and underneath the links are what kind of forms you're going to use and other useful links. It's a very, very good site to use. Okay. But irrespective of all of that, a detailed discussion with your supervisor about what's needed before contacting R&D. Have that discussion with them first. Or even completing IRAS or school ethics, the first point of contact is your supervisor. And is the study doable within those timeframes? Thinking about the ethics, and here we are thinking about, okay, if we put in the ethics, how long is it going to take? Normally 20 working days for your ethics to be processed, so you have to factor that into your timelines. If you're planning to undertake multi-site projects, again, it's very unusual for students to do that. It's going to take much longer. And you have to build in slippage time to your ethics if you hit a speed bump, because quite often ethics approvals that are submitted by students are rarely accepted on the first submission. So you have to resubmit them again and wait for that approval. So although I'm saying 20 working days, you could actually find it 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and you have to think about factoring that in. My strongest advice to you, having been an ethics chair, is make sure your ethics approval form is as good as it can be and of a very high standard when you put it in. Because you don't want a comment coming back to say, you haven't mentioned a consent form. You're missing this or you're missing that, because that's going to delay you. Okay, so high standard, and it gets very frustrating for students. It's also very frustrating for the reviewers as well if there's very obvious things that are missing. So take the time to look at the guidance on the HLS web pages, and for internal ethics, the EC1 form is the form you will be using, and it's got detailed guidance on it. Follow the parameters it states in terms of the headings that are used, and the guidance sheet that goes with it tells you exactly what to write. There is also a participant information sheet exemplar, which you'll be able to use and modify to fit with your own study. There is a lot of information there that will make it easier for you. And yes, you can cut and paste from your EERDIP protocol straight into that if it's applicable. That's not subject to any academic turn-it-in text matching, so you can breathe a sigh of relief over that one. So that's really just what I've said. High standard, checked and approved by your supervisor. They have to sign it before it come in. Don't be tempted if your supervisor, it doesn't happen very often, but I have heard supervisors saying just put it in and get feedback. You don't want that. That'll cost you 3 weeks. Okay. The other issues we have covered in terms of data collection, and it's your responsibility to make sure you have all of the ethics in place before you start data collection, because we are not responsible for your actions in terms of undertaking ethics, and that's why you've got a supervisor to guide you through the process. If you need to make subsequent alterations to your ethics, you can do that. It's very simply done through chair's action, so that doesn't necessarily delay the process. But in preparing the ethical submission, you want to detail your approaches to sampling, that's ethical. Similarly, recruitment, consent, confidentiality, data collection, handling, storage, and disposal processes. The Ethics Committee are not going to sit and scrutinise whether your methodology is appropriate or not. That's not the role of the committee. It also won't comment strongly in your literature review, but it wants to see clearly defined aims and outcomes in a methodology that does appear appropriate. I think I've commented once in the last 5 years about a methodology I didn't think was appropriate, and I simply said to the student, please go and talk to your supervisor about this, because it wasn't consistent with what they were doing. but it's not the ethics role to comment on these issues. These issues here are the key issues we will be looking at in terms of protecting patients and yourself and our reputation as a university in supporting you through that process. Participant information sheet, can't stress this enough. It's amazing how many times they come back and I have to return it to say it's not completed properly. So take the time to do it. Think about your group. If you're dealing with staff, then you're likely to use language that's a bit more perhaps jargon related or of a higher standard. The reading age of most people in the UK is 9 years old. If you're dealing with a third sector agency, you need to simplify the language. Think about your group, okay? So, key issues, these are the headings you need to populate. The introduction to the study, which is saying, why me, what's the purpose? And don't be deluded by the fact that you think you're going to change the world with this. Keep that for your PhD. The main issue why you want them to take part is to help you complete your Masters, and you need to make that evident to them at the get-go. Yes, the knowledge that might be drawn from that in terms of the data they supply may help us to change particular areas or inform a body of knowledge, but primarily it's to help you complete your Masters. Want to know what's involved? Time, effort, the type of data that will be collected and how it will be collected. Do they have to take part? No, they don't, but you have to make that absolutely explicit. What are the advantages, the risks? And that's about commitment, time, observation, sensitive topic area, whatever it is, you have to be really honest with them. And what are the possible benefits? And as I said before, usually none directly, but it might contribute to knowledge. What happens when the research study stops? Quite clearly, you're going to produce your dissertation, and you're happy to provide an executive summary on request. Don't be tempted to say that you'll send them your dissertation. Some students say you really don't want to send someone 16,500 words in the post. They're probably not that interested either. What if there's a problem? Generally speaking, if you've done your job with this, you don't anticipate any problems. But in that context, you have to be able to let people know that if there is a problem, who they can contact. And it has to be someone who's out with the research team in as much as you and your supervisor. Generally speaking, I would say put Nicola Roberts down as the ethics chair. So you've got a name in the frame that says, if you've got a problem. They'll also want to know what happens to the information that you give. You don't want to provide a detailed description of how you're going to do analytical coding or themes, etc., etc. You simply want to say to them that all the information will be collated, amalgamated, analysed, drawing on quotes, and perhaps publication or conference, but no one will be identified. So again, we're thinking about that issue of confidentiality, anonymity, and the data is all anonymised, no names in terms of that. And that's an interesting thing that you need to remember as well in terms of, for those of you who might be doing qualitative work, interview, have a consent form. You certainly don't want to put your consent form stored with your data. You want to store it separately in a secure way, because if that was broken into, then it'd be quite clearly who supplied what. Who's organising the research? Who's funding it? Again, that's up to yourself to think about it, but in the context of this, there's normally, you're undertaking it as part of a master's degree with a supervisor that's experienced, and there's no payment. You want to suggest there's some bias in there. You normally don't pay participants. What will happen? Again, you'll be familiar with this, publication, dissemination, etc. Who's reviewed the study? The ethics committee, gatekeeper permission. Any further details they need, you need to put your contact details in. And then what happens next? What do you want them to do? Now, if it's survey, electronic, you want them to move to a link, click, whatever. If it's to contact you to arrange interviews, you want to be able to say that. Whatever the context is, they need to know exactly what do I need to do to take part. And that has to be crystal clear. As I've said before, the exemplars are all there on the web link, and that, again, really just details what we've covered already. Particularly with patients, what if they don't agree? You have to reassure them that there's going to be no change to their current treatment, management or care. And if it's another group, there's no sanctions, in as much as if I don't want to take part in this, can I still be part of a third sector group? Or if I'm in education, if I don't take part, will I be penalised? Will I get marked down for X, Y or Z? Whatever it is, you have to ensure them that they can withdraw without penalty in any shape or form. And that's probably the watchword there. If you're having to go down the external ethics route, your supervisors will guide you through the process. They will be the chief investigator, and you will be the principal investigator. And they will also have access to the system because they're required to go in and sign it off once you've completed all the electronic documents. And once approved, as I said before, you have to log that with the university committee. We've talked a little bit about studies that don't require external approval. They'll come through the university. And this committee, again, doesn't differentiate with the fact that you're a student, but staff also use this because we are a university and we have a research active community. So the same standard is applied whether you're a student or a member of staff in terms of completing the EC1 for high risk or low risk. If you're undertaking a low risk study, which I'm convinced all of yours are, it's only 2 pages. You can cut and paste from your EERDIP, and a lot of it is tick box. Okay? Should be reviewed by your supervisor. It's electronically submitted, and we want confirmation of gatekeeper access. The EC1 form will contain a title, a version number, and that's important if you resubmit. And if you have to resubmit because the scrutineers have said you need to address X or Y, when you resubmit, it becomes version 2, and any changes you've made, please highlight so that we can see immediately where you've made the adaptations. So we're looking for aims and objectives, participants, recruitment methods, and it's brief commentary around design and methods, risk to participants. What are you doing in terms of debriefing and feedback? Feedback could be the executive summary. Debriefing might be dependent on the type of topic that you're exploring, where it might be a sensitive issue. So for example, if you were doing something on abuse or sexual health, you might want someone there in the background should someone become upset. But you would also, in your participant information sheet, say that people can stop at any point in the process. Any other special considerations, and that would be around vulnerable groups and your gatekeeper access. As I said before, there are 3 committees within the school. There's one for nursing, there's one for allied health, and there's one for life sciences. Life sciences will never apply to anyone in this room, but the first 2 may. So nursing and public health will go to nursing, and obviously physiotherapy will be with the allied health. The committee aims to respond within 20 days. If you've not heard anything within about 3 weeks, you send an email back to them and say, where's my ethics? Okay. Support is available from your supervisor. I can't stress this enough. Also the local ethics committee. If you're not very sure whether this is ethics or not, in terms of do I need it, do I not, phone them up and ask them. I found them very, very helpful. Certainly your R&D office for anything to do with the NHS, and of course you can phone any of the school committee chairs to discuss. Okay, so we've come to the end of the ethics. Have you got any questions? Yes.
Do you need to submit